We're visiting with Bob Simmons. Bob, your parents, George and Anna Simmons, moved to Canton from Ohio in 1912, and they bought a farm on Denton Road. What stories did they tell you about the move here and those first years of farming?
Well, anything you say about me has to go back to my folks. I'd like to go back just a little further. My dad was born in Ohio, and when he grew up, he worked 7 years as a hired man on a farm. My mother was born in a sod house in Nebraska to an Englishman that had come over from England. He starved out, came back to Ohio, where his brothers were. Then her mother died when she was about 12, and he wasn't able to hang on to the family, so she was the one that was farmed out to some folks that ran the elevator in town and had a 160-acre farm, 3 little children, and she took care of those and went to school. They did see that she had a high school education. Somehow or other, my dad and my mother got together later on. Mother was a cousin to the woman that he worked for by the month. That's the wife anyway. And somehow they got together. Then they farmed 2 years on a rented farm in Ohio. Then they bought this place on Denton Road. They came in on the railroad in boxcars. It was in the early spring of 1912. Dad said the mud was going up the horses' stomachs out south of them there. Some of their stuff had to be left with another cousin in Denton until the road settled down. And the place was quite run down. It had been rented for several years. I was born in 1913 then, in September. I tell this story that the year I was born, my father and Harry Crow, rode to interurban to Detroit, went to the stockyard and bought a bunch of feeders cattle, opened the gate in the stockyard, and drove them home on Ford Road. By the time they got home, I guess my dad was pretty tired. I don't know if this was just before I was born or just after, but anyhow. And my sister was born in August of 16. And that made the family. Right in here, I'd like to talk about Mrs. Carter because she came to take care of Mother when my sister was born. I don't remember this, but she told me about it, and my dad told me about it. She spent 2 weeks there, and my father said he never missed a meal. And she told me later when I'd grown up that he asked her how much he owed her. She wanted $10. He said, that isn't enough. He gave her 15. And after that, she charged 15, and nobody complained. She was one of my mother's better friends. Her father was an escaped slave that went to Chatham, Canada, married an Irish Indian woman. Mrs. Carter was the daughter of that combination, married a black man and had several children, came back into this country sometime, I don't know when. Later on, she left her man. He got kind of mean and lived with her children, but her and her children were always part of our family. And they were really important people in this community, even though some people may not have thought so. She did most of the practical nursing for Dr. Arnold from Denton, and he often said if he could get Mrs. Carter, he'd pull them through. So that's rather important to me. Another family that lived right there was Bill Suckett and his mother, and kind of amusing that he was kind of an old devil that hung around Charlie Smith's and played cards, but when I was a year old, he brought a high chair home on the streetcar. So you can imagine what an old bachelor got in that situation. In 1919, I started school at Cherry Hill. My first teacher was Hattie Corwin. Second teacher was Mary Jameson. Next was Doris, slipped my mind. Anyway, then about that time my mother got on the school board and we had quite a bit of change in the neighborhood. What had been some rented farms in the neighborhood were sold and permanent people came on. The Clarks lived just north of us. They owned that farm, but when Dad moved there, it was rented to a family of Mayhorners. Where Buster Grummel eventually lived, and Gills own it now, that belonged to a butcher in Ypsilanti and was a rented farm until Spencer Grummel bought it. Just east of Proctor's was the Emerine farm, owned by a man that lived in Denton and rented it out. He sold it eventually to Rance Hall. And Rance Hall brought Denton Moyle in as a hired man, and later Denton became quite a character in this neighborhood. Need to talk about going to market. As soon as I was old enough to go with my mother, she was going to the Western market with chickens and homemade butter, eggs, and in the summertime we'd have some flowers and some lima beans was a big thing. We used to had 4 big market baskets. I wasn't big enough to carry them, but I would watch 2 of them while she got the other 2 into the market, and then she'd come and get the other 2. And a little later on, when things kind of opened up, she'd hold it back off a little. We'd catch the interurban in Denton at 4 o'clock in the morning. If it was foggy, we lit a piece of newspaper and threw it on the track so the motorman would see it and stop for us. Then at first I ate hot dogs from the stand down the middle of the market, but got sick a couple of times, and then she'd send me across the road across Michigan Avenue to a cafeteria for some breakfast. Remember about half the traffic was horses, and the trucks were hard rubber tires, and quite a few women rode that interurban to the market there with the same stuff. Later on, I caught a few pigeons out of the barns and sold them for 50 cents a pair on the market. And when I was in high school, I had some rabbits. By that time, let's see. Yeah, by that time my sister was driving and they drove to market with a car. But they tore up the interurban the first year I was in high school in double track Michigan. I rode the streetcar the first year of high school. One thing in grade school, and I spoke of Mary Jameson being a teacher. She later was helping teacher for the whole county, and she was very modern. She brought in the handicraft and sewing clubs and hot lunch program. Hot lunch, and we also had what we called a citizenship club. On Friday afternoon, we elected our people for the next week. Certain duties. We had to carry water from across the street to put it in a bubbler fountain, you know, a crock with a bubbler on it. Then we had hot lunch, had a couple of people to plan and cook the lunch. If we had potatoes, everybody brought a potato and we threw them all in together, boiled them up. If we wanted to make, say, tomato soup, we could go down to the creamery and Jim Burrow would give us a gallon of milk. We'd mix it up. If we had eggs, why, they'd write their name on an egg, and then we'd have somebody else was elected to wash dishes, somebody elected to clean blackboards and so on. That was quite an interesting thing. And later years, we tried to institute it at Palmer, and somebody said, my kid ain't gonna do janitor work for nothing. That ended that. At the handicraft club, I got into that as soon as I was old enough, and I did some pretty fair work in handicraft. I don't know about my marks, I can't remember what I did. I got through anyway. We had to go into Plymouth and take 8th grade exams those days. That was kind of an interesting thing. We went in, took exams in the morning, had about an hour or two off for get some lunch, then we took some more examinations. Seems to me we went someplace for a big picnic, got our diplomas.
Is that Elizabeth Park?
Elizabeth Park, yeah. Then I went to high school in Ypsilanti. Well, I ought to tell you a little bit about the change in the community, right? I started that.
Oh, this is great.
Also, there was, at that time about, I think Henry Houck was the first to move here. I can't remember when, but I can't remember when Lenora didn't go to school with me. So. But about 23 or 4 along in there, people were moving from Dearborn out this way in Garden City. And there was 5 Houck brothers. This is in their Canton history. They all came about the same time and settled here. This, along with Newt Yerkeson, who was a son-in-law of Will Houck. They liked this area because by then trucks had become available. They could still go to market. Or when they lived down in Garden City, they could go with the horses. And they kind of changed the politics a little bit. And, the school had been paying all of our tuition. It was $80 to go to school, you know, for the country. They had to pay 2/3 of it, I think it was. Anyway, about that time, one fellow got his tuition paid, and then he got kicked out for smoking. Another fellow took 5 years to go through, and somebody kind of got rebellious, and they cut that third off and said, you're going to pay a third of your own tuition from now on. That's just one of the little things that, you know, it gets interesting sometimes. I went on to high school. I rode the streetcar for the first year. And the day I got off, the last day of school, they was tearing down a house in Denton there, getting ready to widen the Michigan Avenue as far as the county line. And I do have a piece of that old railroad track out home that my cousin that lived in Denton, he helped Lou Stein tear up that railroad, that interurban tracks, and he brought us a piece that he'd cut out like an anvil. So we've got that yet from the streetcar. In high school, I studied agriculture and wood shop and machine shop was my electives. I took the other things we had to take, English, and took chemistry, and 2 years of gym, so on. I never got into sports very much or into extracurricular activities very much. I did graduate in '31, and I went back home to the farm. I'd had an ambition at one time to be a carpenter, but 31 wasn't any time to start that. Well, the folks bought that farm, and I had this old house and barn on it. And in 1924, we went to the state fair. And on the way home, we saw smoke. and when we got home, the barns were gone. I won't say any more than that they burned under mysterious such conditions. And the neighbors came around and helped us gather up what grain was left. Of course, you know, state fair time, you harvested wheat, oats, hay, everything was there, big straw stack. We lost a horse and a colt, well, 2 horses and a colt, and a pair of twin calves. My pony came up that night and smelled all around, stayed away from it. The folks came around and helped us with that, and then my dad and the neighbor kind of laid out the plan they wanted for a floor plan for a barn, and somebody got them in touch with Clint Gottschalk, and his crew put that barn up. We had a big square dance that fall in the barn about this time of year, nice warm evening, and everybody came. I remember one interesting thing, Mrs. Corwin, old Mrs. Corwin, be Hattie Corwin and Milo Corwin's mother. She wanted to come. She was old and sore and stiff. They had 3 ladders up to the hay mow, and she went up the middle and with a man on each side. You know, people really had a good time that night.
Now, did you mention that Harry Gerst was
And
involved?
Harry Gerst was the head carpenter in that crew. He shinnied up to the peak and caught them rafters when they come up, nailed them fast. That was all done with ropes and pike poles, no cranes like they do today. Then the barn looked pretty nice and the house looked terrible, so in 25 they built the house. Clint's gang built that one too, in the summer of 25. I hung around them guys, got in their way about as much as I could. One day, when they started laying the basement, well, first my dad and I dug the basement with a scoop scraper and a horse. I led the horse, he set the scraper. Then I was laying in the basement, and the old man was carrying cement blocks from the yard down into the basement. Dad says, get your pony and hook her onto that stone boat, carry her all cement blocks. So I did that at 10 years old. First that I remember working with the neighbors was butchering bees. Of course, there was thrashing too, but I don't remember the early part. I don't remember any. I just vaguely remember a steam engine being at our place. After that, it was gasoline or internal combustion. But the early bees that I got mixed up in was butchering bees. At that time, a farmer might have a bunch of pigs he'd finished, and a butcher from town would come out and look at them and buy them. Then 2 or 3 neighbors would get together and butcher them, hang them on a pole, and my job was to carry the insides into the house so the women could pick the lard. That was the best lard, that leaf lard that they picked off the insides, and try it out. Always had fresh liver the night we got done butchering. I was pretty small when I was doing that. I could just barely lug them things. But I remember some of those women, when I hit that doorknob, everything got quiet. You could hear them laughing, and I presume there was some stories going around that table too. Then when I was about 14, don't get the idea, I'd never been around this work before, but I guess I ought to back up a little. Even when before that, and I got my pony, and my dad would say, we're thrashing over here today. If you want to come over later see what we're doing while you can ride the pony. Well, I never went home to dinner. I'd get in the bin and shovel oats or something, and the men would see to it I got my dinner. And then when I was 14, we harnessed a team one morning, and Bert Newton came in to pitch in the field, and Dad says, take this kid out in the field and teach him how to load. And that day we thrashed 20 acres of wheat at our place. And I took my turn in the loads. Bert saw to it I put every bundle where it belonged. And I was a teamster from then on. I want to say that all of those fellas I was the youngest one in the gang. Nobody ever tried to lead me astray or teach me to chew tobacco or anything else. There was a couple of pretty rough characters, but was kind of, I like to tell the kids now that we carried water to the field in a stoneware jug, and these old fellows would take the cud out of their mouth and take a big drink, hand it to me, and put the cud back. They wouldn't talk about pollution nowadays, but we never got anything. I guess the nicotine killed all the germs. I rode that pony to school the first couple of years and put it in a barn across the street there. Then the third year I got the cart. My sister started the school. We drove that. Sometimes, if the weather was real bad, I walked, I guess, and I walked some. Then I wanted to tell about the change in the neighborhood there. Proctor's moved into the farm north of us. The man before that, he didn't particularly care for kids. He didn't have any of his own, and if I was going away from the corner, he went right on by. But when Mr. Proctor moved in, he liked kids, and he timed his milk hauling so that he picked us up. About 1924, the Holdings and the Mays moved in there. You know Dorothy West, she was a May. And then Mr. Proctor would have my sister and I and those 4 May kids and the 2 Holding kids all in that little pickup hauling his milk. And that kind of ended driving the pony. That was too easy for it. Proctors and us worked together just like one company practically, and up until we got combines. Then we kind of went our own ways. But we were in the thrashing gang, and eventually we bought our own machine. Thrashing crews kind of fizzled out. Thrashing crews is kind of interesting. You've probably heard it before, but anywhere from 15, 20 men get together as teams, and early on they carried grain to the granaries, but later they put it on trucks and they carted it over there. The teams haul the grain in and thrash. Dad'd get up early in the morning and go to town and buy meat because they didn't have any refrigeration. Then if it rained at 11 o'clock, well, they'd all go home and wouldn't stay to dinner. And you had that stuff. That was a woman's problem. Have that stuff to try to take care of. Proctor women and my mother always worked together on the dinners, and ate good at those. It was all good cooks. I guess that kind of takes care of up until, I would say Dad never wanted to milk very many cows. He'd have a few around for their own use, and his mother made butter, took it to market. But then when I graduated from high school, why we got into the milk business accidentally, and for a long time we had a deal with John Baisley. He furnished milk to Eloise, and there was about a dozen of us. that hauled milk over to his place, and then he took it into Eloise, which you know what Eloise is, county building. We took 100 cans of milk in there, put it in the kitchens, and I rode with the driver sometimes. So what was kind of interesting to see some of those people. There was 9,000 poor men living in the barracks across the river. Nothing wrong with them, they're just out of work. This was 1931, 2, 4, so on. The milk business was rather interesting to me. And later on, we basically gave that deal up and we sold to Wilson. I want to follow along that line, then come back again. Along about when? I think after the war, we got into artificial insemination. And we were among the first in this area. It really changed the dairy cows in the neighborhood. Within 2 years, you could look at a bunch of heifers in the field and say that man's using artificial, and another field you could say he wasn't. And that to me is one of the greatest improvements for the dairyman.
What changes did you see?
What
changes did you see?
Well, you see, before we had to keep a bull, and we couldn't afford to go out and buy a high-priced bull. And anyhow, our usual system was to get a registered bull calf and raise him. Well, about the time he got old enough to know whether his offspring was going to be any good or not, he was getting too big to keep around. And a lot of other fellas, they used what we call stockyard bulls. They just go down to the yard and buy anything they saw. And that didn't improve the breed at all. But when we got into artificials, that was a cooperative thing. Our barns were up at the college, and we had a board of men who were in the registered business, who knew their business and buying, and all of those bulls were old enough on the start. All of them were old enough that they knew what their prodigy was going to be. So they had daughters that was doing better than their mothers. In other words, proven bulls, we call them. And they weighed a ton, so working them was well, they had it fixed up so that the man never had to be worried about getting hurt. But to work a bull that size was rather dangerous. But a ton was a small bull up at the.
What changes did you notice in the cattle themselves? Did they physically change?
They became some of the old showmen liked a fine boned animal, but these fellas went for a rib cage with lots of capacity. They said if they're going to produce milk, they got to be able to eat a lot, process it. They're actually a factory. And so they went to a heavier frame. They used to see a tails on them that's about as big as your finger. They got so the tail was 1.5 inches in diameter, and they just simply began to produce milk. And it's just kept on going. When I quit milking, a cow that gave 12,000 pounds a year was considered good. I think Gill's over here has run the herd average of 20,000 pounds. So today, Gills keep their own semen in a freezer there and do their own inseminating. When we was only small, we had a man that did that work. But Gills with 450 cows, there's some cows to be taken care of every day, They have their stuff right there doing. Well, I was only 17 when I graduated. 18 in the fall, right after. See, with us, And for the next 3 years, I just about stayed on the farm and did nothing else. That got kind of boring after a while. I began to get restless. But I guess I was 21 before I really kind of got out from under the halter, you know. I remember one summer evening after I'd been out of school a couple of years, I said to Dad, I guess I'll drive over to the store and see what the fellas are talking about. He had a kind of a rough look on his face, and he looked at my mother. I think she shook her head or something, and he said, well, go ahead. You know, he'd kept me under pretty close. But I got started to go into the square dances when I was 20, 21, and I think that really changed my life quite a lot. Fooled around for about a year, and then while I was subbing on the mail route for our mailman, I met Ruth in the post office, took her to a square dance one night, and courted her for a few years, and she said it was about time we got married. So in 1937 we got married. We were both 24 at the time. It was in between birthdays. Her birthday, she was a year older than I was. And oh, it's been a good life anyway. Our first daughter was born. We was married in October of 37, and November of 38, why Jane was born. And May of 40, Sally was born. We moved in with my folks, and Ruth got along real well with my mother for 12 years. During this time, of course, we had World War II. They built the bomber plant, shut off Denton Road. When I was going to see Ruth, I went right through Denton Road to Belleville. They built the bomber plant, and I was, of course, registered for the draft. They sent me a questionnaire, and I filled it out, how many cows and how many chickens and so on. They called me down once, and something about my questionnaire. When I walked in, I told her they asked for me. Well, she says, was you ever arrested? And I said, no, I never was arrested. Is that all you want to know? And that's the last I heard of it, except I got a card that said I was 4A, that's agriculture. And so I missed, of course I was getting a little age on me by then anyway, and the girls was 4 and 5 years old. They started building those bombers over there. They came out of there just like chickens out of a chicken coop, you know. And if they'd have a little bad weather, they'd go right over our place on their test runs just as fast as they could take off. We'd be looking, there's an airplane here, and by the time it got here, there's another one here. And so Ford really won the war for us, all with that.
That was Willow Run. Willow Run.
Willow Run. We helped a couple of farmers move out of Willow Run. That reminds me of that. All that land that's now Willow Run was farmland, and the government just condemned it and bought it up, you know. I guess they did all right, because the two that we knew anyway did real well. They had a lot of temporary housing in Willow Run. Probably you've been told this before. We couldn't buy a decent board to build some tables for the ladies' aid, but when they tore that thing down, I bought number 1 lumber out of it, and then somebody's taken it over and developed what it is today. Temporary housing looked almost like 2 trailers shoved together, and people lived in those, worked in the plant. They also had a bunch of barracks over there, or rooms for single people. The girls that worked there said they locked the door so the guard wouldn't bother them. 1947, Mrs. Emmerine, another Mrs. Emmerine, who had a farm on Geddes Road, and she came to see us, and she was thinking of selling it. And I said, "Oh, think right here for a while. My dad isn't home. You come back tonight and we'll see what somebody else wanted to buy it." But we'd been looking for a little more land, and she had 100 acres she wanted to sell, and we bought it. She didn't want to take cash, so we had saved a little money, and we made a down payment. And we let the Eloises live there. He was her son-in-law. They lived there for a couple of years, and their son lived there. Well, I guess Eloise was just a year, and then their son lived a couple of years there. We stayed with the folks, and then we decided we better get over there. And my dad didn't like that. He liked my girls real well, but we moved over there, and then all the time, Mother always had chickens, and Ruth and Mother. When we went over to Geddes, we built a chicken coop. Then we fixed up the end of the old barn, and so we ran 300 chickens there on Geddes Road all the time, 150 in each coop, and sold all our eggs on the road. I always gave the women a lot of credit for that chicken money, because it bought our groceries and practically run the house. And sometimes my dad had a hard time seeing it, but I don't think he realized how much really came in the chicken money. Every fall, Mother'd take us into the department store and outfit us for clothes, that was egg money. I couldn't wear overalls to school. My mother wouldn't stand for that. Once in a while when they were brand new, most of the farm boys did, but anyhow. Our girls started school in Cherry Hill when Ford was taking care of it. Sally went there, I think, 1 year, and then we got moved over. And they went to Fowler School for a few years. Eventually, we consolidated Fowler School. The school north of us wanted to go in to Bull Run, and they wouldn't take them, wouldn't jump over us. And I got a little flack for favoring the consolidation, but on the school board and had 20 kids with 5 different religions. All of them had things they wouldn't do. And I was kind of tired of that, and I thought they'd have better education anyway. Our girls went from there to Roosevelt High School, and our boy then, when it consolidated, he went to Denton and then to Belleville, graduated from Belleville. Let's back up and do a little Canton politicking.
Good, I was going to get to that.
Back in the 20s, I guess my dad always was kind of interested, let's go way back. Our road system was a pathmaster system. We had a county or a township road commissioner, and Clyde Truesdell was highway commissioner quite a bit. And that pathmaster system tended to people fix the road in front of their place and no place else, But in our district up there, when Proctor's came in and Spencer Grummel, about that time the township started buying some gravel, and you had a road tax which you could work out Some people kept the scrubber handy and they rode down to the field on the scrubber and then rode back at night, and that was their road work, you know. But Dad and Proctors and Brummels said, let's donate our road work, turn that money into the township and get twice as much gravel, and we'll start at your place and gravel out to Ridge Road. And so we did, and we got that built up in good shape. Then, a little later, we used to have to shovel our own snow too, you know. That's another interesting thing. When I got driving to high school, sometimes have to shovel snow for a mile, get home. And everybody, Proctors and Brummels helped us all the time with that, and we helped them and everything. But then the county took over the roads. And the first thing they did was scrape that gravel out and make that road so 2 cars could pass. And of course that put the gravel on the ditch bank and the mud in the middle of the road. And they started all over again. But about along in the 20s, my dad got elected as a justice. At that time you had 4 justice apiece. 2 of them were senior justices. They were elected for a 4-year term, 2 of them every 2 years. So the senior justice was a member of the township board. The junior justices were fence viewing committee. He got elected, and he was a junior justice in 1932 when Roosevelt was elected. So he carried over. He was the only Republican left in Canton Township after Roosevelt was elected. And he evidently thought enough of and got along well enough that he stayed in office for 12 years with old Phil Dingley and those fellows that were, he served, I think, 2 years as treasurer just before we were married. An interesting point of that, half of the township taxes was delinquent, and you had to write the delinquent roll by hand. So,
Took a while.
depression. I guess I got kind of involved in politics, but not deeply. I was involved in petition to build this fire hall down here at Canton Center in Cherry Hill. The officers didn't want to do it. Butch Waldecker was supervisor, and he wanted to build a fire hall. And we got that built by a lot of chewing match. Finally brought it to the vote of the people. The old fire hall, or the old township hall, was still boards and battens, if you know what that construction means. And
Why don't you explain it? Why don't you explain it?
well, boards and battens is 12-inch boards with a 2-inch strip over the cracks rather than matched lumber. And the stove inside had no grates in it. You had to, if you had a board meeting in the township hall, you had to carry in an armful of wood and build a fire and set around the stove. I remember going to board meetings with my dad when I was young. I hadn't thought of this, but the welfare situation. I remember I'd sit in the corner and listen to the guys, you know. Well, so-and-so came over and she needed shoes for them kids to go to school. So Phil bought her some shoes. That'd be Phil's uncle, Phil. The Phil that you might know. And somebody else had come and they needed flour, or somebody needed oil, out of oil. And that was a welfare system up until this depression business, and it just got so big that it had to be a system of some kind. But I can remember when it was, you just went to the supervisor if you was in trouble and he saw you through somehow. It was against the law to let you starve.
You had mentioned 4-H and Farm Bureau.
Oh, yeah. Well, as I said, I was in the handicraft clubs. Our daughters were in sewing club a little. And then my son, when he came along, it was either 4-H or Cub Scouts. I didn't lean toward Cub Scouts, but I gave him a choice. And he went for 4-H, so he raised a cow, and he got involved in the bee business through the 4-H. And I got to working in the 4-H fair, and Ruth, for a number of years, with Ralph Birch, I handled the parking. And Ruth worked with Margaret Bunyan, the Farm Bureau women, on that lunch that they served in the hall. Excuse me. So we kind of helped build that fair over there. It got started before I got involved, but got involved in that. That bee business, eventually I inherited it and wound up with 15 hives before I moved out of this country. I didn't want anything to do with it on the start. Well, I've got a note here about that bomber plant. We could hear them test their machine guns, and we told our girls that was Rosie the riveting. We milked cows, as I said, and the women had their chickens, and about 1957, my dad started to go downhill, and in 59 he died. Ruth and I kept that cow business going for another 4 or 5 years. I think in 62 we sold the cows when we were married 25 years. That meant that I'd been in it for 30, but it just got to the point where we was a little too small to hire a man, a little too big for one man, and was working her to death trying to help me, and so we sold the cows. My mother still lived there on the farm, and we was on Geddes Road. I've bought calves and raised them, sold them for beef for about 5 years, and then I went in the elevator and wanted some corn cobs, and the man said he couldn't have any, everybody wanted them. And I just got home and he called me up and said, one of my men went off deer hunting and left me short-handed. You help me out for a couple of weeks, I'll give you lots of corn cobs. So I went in, and 2 weeks went into 2 months, and the neighbors got to saying, what are you going to do? Are you going to work here, or are you going to farm? And I talked it over with Ruth and decided that we could do more fishing if we worked for the Farm Bureau. So I rented the farm out and went into the Farm Bureau, and it must have been the fall of '65, and I worked there for 10 years. Soon after we did that, my mother had a little trouble, and she wanted to move over with us. She sold that 40 acres to Horseman, and we were still rented the 80 to Bob Schultz. She was healthy right up to the end, practically. I remember working at the 4-H fair there one day when one of the guys come down and said, guess who's scrubbing the baseboard? Your mother. She was over 80 then. We eventually sold the land. After Mother died, we sold that 12 acres. It wound up, we sold it to somebody, but just shortly after, the same people that bought Proctor's and Schultz's bought that 80 acres. And then I sold the other farm, part of it to Edison Company and part of it to Gills. But Mother always worked in the Ladies Society, and early on when I was in grade school, they'd have these ladies' aid dinners in West Hall, up above the store. And I remember Mother used to walk over there. That was 2 miles anyway. She'd walk over there and work the afternoon on those dinners. And then Dad us kids would go home, and Dad would get us ready after he had his work done. We'd come back to the ladies' aid dinners. Then as my sister grew up, why she worked in that, and my mother worked with her. The older ladies they kind of quieted down, didn't, and Reverend Nevin kind of started up a young group, which would have been my sister and Eleanor Buckner and Betty Friedel, group that age. Alice McKim, she was a folk girl that used to live here. Her father ran the store. Then of course, later on they built the fellowship hall in the church. And then when Ruth came out to the farm, why, she had always been church active. And she'd always worked in the ladies' business with her mother. She just became the driver for my mother and worked in that group. Seems in our family there never was that age division. During the war, these girls served a lot of dinners to chicken dinners, meat was rationed. So Ruth and Mother and those other girls, they'd get together and dress a bunch of chickens and serve dinner to the Rotary Club from Plymouth, or the Kiwanis Club, or anybody that wanted it. But the Rotary and Kiwanis, they like to entertain the farmers once a year, and they'd come out to Cherry Hill for a chicken dinner, put on dinners to raise money and so on. I got active. I got to be a Sunday school superintendent for a while. I didn't know much about it, but I did. I worried through it. Interesting, at one time we had a layman Sunday when the 3 of us laymen were supposed to give a 5-minute talk. It turned out to be an extremely cold Sunday, and Mr. Gill was one speaker, I was one, I can't remember the other one. We wound up with us 3 men and our 3 wives for a congregation. And Mr. Gill, we sang a couple of songs, and Mr. Gill talked for 15 minutes, and I got up and pronounced the benediction. Went home. When the Proctors that moved up here owned 40 acres on Ford Road, just this side of the Rouge River and Ford's Woods there. And they had trouble with Ford and his deer in the early days. But they told us after they moved up here and we talked about that, they said that was not uncommon at all down there for people to drive cattle out of Detroit. If they wanted to move them, they just drove them down the road. Said they would watch, if they saw cattle coming, they'd make sure they didn't get in the gates or something. Well, the well on the place was condemned, on the school grounds was condemned, but there was a well in the basement of that old store building. And it was hard to get water east of the Ridge Road. But up at the store and at the creamery there was real good wells. So that well in the basement of the store furnished water for that whole row of houses down there. There was a hydrant in the corner of the blacksmith shop, which later turned into a garage, Dunstan's. And that was one of our duties in the citizenship club, 2 boys to carry water, pour it in the bubbler fountain. We had, we had a bench with a wash basin on it where we could wash our hands at noon. We had outside toilets. Our schedule, I think, was 9 o'clock, and about 10:30 we had 15-minute recess and an hour at noon, and then in the middle of the afternoon, we had 15 minutes, and first grade went home, and the rest stayed until 4. So we played all the games that kids played, pom, pull away, and in the wintertime, fox and geese. We made track in the snow, you know, and we played baseball. Our teachers, most all of our teachers got right in the ball game with us, or at least watched it. And we played a game called workup. We never chose sides. The batter got out, he went to the last field, and then he worked up through the bases and pitch and catch and then batting. 3 batters, and had 1 ball for the season, and we had a couple of swings in the trees. I remember a hired man there that worked in the neighborhood right there in Cherry Hill. He brought us a baseball one day, a hard ball. He'd been down to Detroit and he caught a foul ball that Ty Cobb hit. He took care of that ball. Those older kids saw to it that you picked that ball up and put it away when you went. It's kind of amusing now when the little church league guy was going to a couple of years ago, had a new ball every game. They had a bag of balls when the season was over. We played horseshoes behind the school sometimes. We had with real horseshoes, not standard. You know, brought shoes from home. Pa probably wondered where they went to. And we built our own teeter-totter out there. I remember one day, this is the silly things that stick in your mind, you know. 4 of us was on a teeter-totter, and one of them on one end rolled off when he was down. You know, it was like one behind the other. Here's 2 of them up on the other end. They went down like that. This kid went up all by himself.
Looking back on your life here, what would you say was really special about living in a farming community?
Well, the thing that I really enjoyed was the work together, and the fact that as a farmer, if you're thinking right, you're a steward of the land, you know, and you're going to take care of it. My father felt that way. I did too. Try to leave it better than you found it. And Bob Schultz tells me that that's the best piece of ground in the country over there. So, and the working together, those fellows took care of me, you know. Saw to it I did it right. Till right today, I have a hard time tolerating sloppy work.